The winter winds howled across the Nebraska plains as Mary Thompson clutched her swollen belly and tried to steady herself against the wooden wagon wheel. Her husband James had left 3 days ago to trade with the settlers in the next valley, promising to return before the babies came. But nature had other plans, and the sharp pains shooting through her back told her that her twins were ready to enter the world, whether their father was there or not. Mary had been living on the frontier for 2 years now, ever since she and James had decided to leave their comfortable life in Ohio to seek fortune in the untamed West. They had built a small cabin near a creek, thinking the isolation would bring them peace and prosperity. But as Mary doubled over with another contraction, she realized how foolishly unprepared they had been for the harsh realities of frontier life. The nearest neighbor was Mrs. Henderson, who lived 15 miles away across dangerous territory. Mary had no way to reach her, and even if she could, the woman was nearly 70 years old and barely able to care for herself. As the contractions grew stronger and more frequent, Mary understood with growing terror that she would have to deliver these babies completely alone. She stumbled back into the one-room cabin, her hands shaking as she gathered the clean cloth she had been saving for this moment. The fire in the small stone hearth was burning low, and she threw another log onto the flames, knowing she would need warmth for the babies when they arrived. Outside, the wind continued to rage, rattling the wooden shutters and making the entire cabin creak ominously. Mary had assisted with births back in Ohio, helping her mother deliver 3 of her younger siblings, but she had never imagined doing this without help. She spread the clean cloths on the rough wooden bed that James had built with his own hands, and tried to remember everything her mother had taught her about bringing new life into the world. The first baby arrived just as the sun was setting behind the snow-covered hills. Mary bit down on a leather strap to keep from screaming, not wanting to attract any unwanted attention from wild animals or hostile natives that might be roaming the area. The tiny boy slipped into her trembling hands, his skin blue and cold, but his lungs strong enough to fill the cabin with his angry cries. She wrapped him quickly in a soft blanket she had knitted during the long winter evenings, holding him close to her chest to warm him while she waited for his brother to follow. The second baby took longer, and Mary's strength was fading fast. She could feel her life force draining away with each passing minute, but she fought to stay conscious long enough to bring both children safely into the world. When the second boy finally arrived, Mary was barely able to catch him. Her hands were weak and covered in blood, and she could feel herself slipping away into darkness. But maternal instinct kept her fighting, and she managed to wrap the second baby and place both boys close together on the bed beside her. As the night wore on, Mary grew weaker and weaker. She had lost too much blood during the difficult delivery, and without proper medical care, she knew she was dying. The babies cried for milk, but she had no strength left to feed them. All she could do was pull them close to her body, hoping her fading warmth would keep them alive until James returned. But James was still 2 days away, and Mary could feel her heart growing slower with each beat. She whispered prayers for her newborn sons, begging God to send someone to save them before it was too late. Outside the cabin, the wind continued to howl, and Mary closed her eyes, preparing to surrender to the darkness that was calling her name. Running Wolf had been tracking the wounded deer for 3 days through the frozen wilderness, following its blood trail across streams and through dense pine forests. As a young warrior of the Lakota tribe, he prided himself on being able to provide meat for his people during the harsh winter months. But this particular deer had proven cleverer than most, leading him farther from his village than he had ever ventured before. The storm that had been building all day finally broke as darkness fell, and Running Wolf knew he needed to find shelter quickly. He had been taught since childhood to read the signs of the land, and his sharp eyes spotted the thin column of smoke rising from a small cabin nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees near a half-frozen creek. His first instinct was to avoid the white settlers dwelling entirely. His people had learned through bitter experience that contact with the pale-skinned invaders usually brought nothing but trouble and violence. Many warriors from neighboring tribes had been killed or driven from their ancestral lands by these newcomers who seemed to multiply like grasshoppers each spring. But as Running Wolf crouched behind a snow-covered boulder and studied the cabin, something seemed wrong. The smoke from the chimney was weak and irregular, as if the fire was nearly dead. No lantern light glowed in the small windows, and there were no sounds of human activity. despite the early evening hour. Most puzzling of all, he could hear the faint but persistent crying of infants carried on the howling wind. Running Wolf's grandmother had been a medicine woman who taught him that all life was sacred, regardless of the color of one's skin. She had often told him stories of how the spirit sometimes called upon warriors to show mercy and compassion to those in need, even to their enemies. As he listened to the babies crying in the darkness, he felt her presence guiding him forward. Moving silently through the snow, Running Wolf approached the cabin with the stealth that had made him one of the most respected hunters in his tribe. He pressed his ear to the rough wooden door and heard the weak whimpering of newborns, but no sounds of adult voices or movement. Something was terribly wrong inside this isolated dwelling. Through a crack in the shutters, he peered into the dim interior and saw a sight that made his heart race with alarm. A young white woman lay motionless on a blood-soaked bed, her face as pale as the snow outside. Beside her, 2 tiny babies squirmed and cried weakly, their small voices growing fainter by the minute. Running Wolf had witnessed death many times as a warrior, and he recognized immediately that the woman was dying or already dead. The babies would not survive much longer in the cold cabin without care and nourishment. Every instinct told him to turn away and continue on his journey, but the memory of his grandmother's teachings and the sound of the helpless infants kept his feet planted firmly in the snow. He knew that entering this cabin would put him in great danger. If other white settlers found him here, they would assume he had attacked this family and would hunt him down without mercy. His own people might cast him out for associating with their enemies. But as another gust of wind shook the cabin and the baby's cries grew even weaker, Running Wolf made a decision that would change his life forever. Carefully, he lifted the wooden bar that secured the door and stepped into the warm, fire-lit interior. The smell of blood and death filled his nostrils, but he forced himself to approach the bed where the tragic scene was unfolding. The woman's chest barely rose and fell with shallow breaths, and her skin had taken on the grayish color that meant she was slipping away to the spirit world. The 2 babies, however, were very much alive, though they were clearly growing weaker from hunger and cold. Running Wolf had helped deliver foals and calves many times, and he understood that these tiny humans needed immediate care if they were going to survive the night. Without hesitation, he scooped up both infants and held them against his warm chest, feeling their small hearts beating rapidly against his ribs. Running Wolf quickly assessed the situation with the practical wisdom his people had taught him since childhood. The woman was still breathing, though barely, and he could see that she had lost a dangerous amount of blood during the difficult birth. His grandmother had trained him in the healing arts, and he knew that without immediate intervention, both the mother and her babies would be dead before dawn. Working swiftly, he built up the dying fire until it blazed strongly, filling the small cabin with warmth and light. He found clean water in a wooden bucket near the door and heated it over the flames, then gathered the herbs from his medicine pouch that might help stop the bleeding and restore the woman's strength. The babies continued to cry weakly in his arms, and Running Wolf knew they needed nourishment urgently. In his village, there were women who had recently given birth and could nurse orphaned infants, but here in this isolated place, he had to find another solution. He searched through the cabin's meager supplies and found a small amount of cow's milk that had been stored in the cold root cellar. Using his knife, he carefully carved a tiny hole in a piece of soft leather, creating a primitive feeding device. Drop by drop, he managed to get small amounts of milk into the babies' mouths, watching anxiously as they swallowed the life-giving liquid. It was painstaking work, but gradually their cries grew stronger and their skin began to warm. Meanwhile, he worked to save their mother's life using every healing technique his grandmother had taught him. He prepared a strong tea from willow bark and wild herbs, forcing small sips between the woman's pale lips. He used strips of clean cloth to pack the wounds and slow the bleeding, then covered her with every blanket and fur he could find in the cabin. As the night wore on, Running Wolf found himself torn between his practical knowledge and his deep-seated cultural beliefs. His people viewed white settlers as invaders who had brought nothing but death and destruction to the land. Many of his own relatives had been killed in conflicts with soldiers and militias, and harboring any sympathy for these people was considered a betrayal of his tribe. But as he looked down at the innocent babies sleeping peacefully in his arms, and at their mother fighting for life on the blood-stained bed, he could not see enemies. He saw only fellow human beings in desperate need of help, And his grandmother's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him that the spirits judged a man not by the color of those he helped, but by the compassion he showed to all living creatures. Throughout the long night, Running Wolf kept a vigil over the small family. He fed the babies every few hours, maintaining the fire, and checking constantly on their mother's condition. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the woman's breathing grew stronger and the terrible gray pallor began to fade from her cheeks. By the time the first rays of dawn crept through the cabin's small windows, Mary Thompson's eyes fluttered open for the first time in nearly 12 hours. She was weak and confused but alive. When she saw the tall, dark-skinned warrior sitting beside her bed holding her newborn sons, her first instinct was terror. Running Wolf recognized her fear and spoke softly in the few English words he had learned from traders who sometimes visited his village. He placed the babies gently in her arms and stepped back, showing her through his actions that he meant no harm. Mary looked down at her sons, healthy and content, then back at the man who had obviously saved all their lives. Despite everything she had been taught about the savage nature of the native people, Mary could see only kindness and concern in Running Wolf's dark eyes. He had risked his own safety to help strangers who many of his people would consider enemies, and she felt a gratitude so deep it brought tears to her eyes. But their moment of peaceful understanding was shattered by the sound of horses approaching the cabin. Through the window, Running Wolf could see 3 white men riding hard toward the dwelling, their faces grim and their hands resting on their weapons. He knew that his presence here would be impossible to explain, and that these men would not hesitate to kill him on sight. Mary saw the fear flash across Running Wolf's face as the sound of approaching horses grew louder. Without thinking, she grabbed his arm and pointed toward the back of the cabin where a small storage area was hidden behind hanging blankets. She had seen enough frontier violence to know that these men would shoot first and ask questions later if they found a native warrior in her home. Running Wolf hesitated for just a moment, torn between the instinct to fight and the wisdom to hide. He could easily escape through the cabin's back window and disappear into the forest, but something in Mary's desperate eyes convinced him to trust her. He slipped quickly into the hiding place just as heavy boots stomped up the wooden steps outside. The door burst open without warning, and 3 rough-looking men entered the cabin with their rifles raised. The leader was a bearded giant named Samuel Crawford, who owned a trading post 50 miles to the east. Behind him came his 2 sons, Jake and Tom, both known throughout the territory for their hatred of the local tribes and their quick tempers. Mary clutched her babies protectively and tried to look as weak and helpless as possible, which was not difficult given her recent ordeal. Samuel looked around the cabin suspiciously, taking in the warm fire, the clean bandages, and the obvious signs that someone had been caring for her throughout the night. Samuel Crawford had been tracking unusual horse prints in the snow for 2 days, and the trail had led him directly to this isolated cabin. The prints were unshod, indicating they belonged to an Indian pony, and he was certain that hostile warriors were operating in the area. Finding a white woman alone with newborn babies only confirmed his worst suspicions. Mary forced herself to remain calm as Samuel questioned her about what had happened. She told them truthfully that she had given birth alone while her husband was away trading, but she carefully avoided mentioning anything about the man who had saved her life. When Samuel asked how she had managed to survive such a difficult delivery without help, she claimed that God had given her strength and that she had somehow managed on her own. But Samuel was not easily fooled. He noticed that the fire had been expertly maintained throughout the night, and that the herbs used to treat her wounds were not the kind that white settlers typically kept in their cabins. Most telling of all, the babies appeared far too healthy and well-fed for infants who had been born to a dying mother with no assistance. Jake Crawford, the more hot-headed of the 2 sons, began searching the cabin methodically, while his father continued questioning Mary. He overturned furniture and searched through every container, looking for evidence of the Indian presence he was certain they would find. When he approached the storage area where Running Wolf was hidden, Mary's heart began racing with terror. She knew she had to create a distraction, so she suddenly cried out in pain and clutched her stomach as if she were suffering from complications related to the birth. Both babies began crying in response to her distress, and the 3 men rushed to her bedside, momentarily forgetting their search. Mary begged them to ride immediately to fetch Mrs. Henderson, claiming that she needed a woman's help with the babies and that she feared she might be bleeding internally. Samuel was torn between his desire to continue hunting for Indians and his reluctant sense of duty to help a fellow settler in need. While the men debated what to do next, Running Wolf remained perfectly still in his hiding place, barely breathing as he listened to the conversation. He understood enough English to know that these men suspected his presence, and he was prepared to fight his way out if necessary to protect Mary and her children. Tom Crawford, the younger son, argued that they should continue searching the area for signs of the Indians who had obviously been helping the woman. He was convinced that this was part of some larger plot against the white settlements, and he wanted to organize a militia to hunt down every native in the territory. But Samuel was more concerned with practical matters. If the woman died because they failed to get her proper medical attention, her husband would hold them responsible. And if she lived, she might be able to provide valuable information about the Indians who had been in contact with her. Finally, Samuel made his decision. Tom would ride to fetch Mrs. Henderson while he and Jake remained at the cabin to protect Mary and continue searching for evidence of Indian activity. It was not the outcome Mary had hoped for, but at least one of the dangerous men would be leaving the immediate area. As Tom mounted his horse and rode off toward the Henderson farm, Mary realized that she had bought Running Wolf some time, but his situation remained desperately dangerous. Samuel and Jake were not going to give up their search easily, and sooner or later they would discover the hiding place that concealed her unlikely savior. Hours passed in tense silence as Samuel and Jake maintained their vigil in the small cabin. Mary continued to nurse her babies and pretend to rest, but her mind was racing as she tried to think of a way to help Running Wolf escape safely. She could hear the men moving around the cabin, checking and rechecking every corner for signs of the Indian presence they were certain existed. Samuel had found several small clues that confirmed his suspicions. The type of knots used to tie the bandages around Mary's wounds were not the kind that white women typically learned, and there were traces of unfamiliar herbs near the fireplace that did not grow anywhere in the immediate vicinity. Most damning of all, he had discovered a single bead outside the cabin that clearly came from native jewelry. As the afternoon wore on, Jake grew increasingly impatient and aggressive. He was convinced that his father was being too cautious, and he wanted to tear the cabin apart until they found proof of what had really happened there. When he started once again toward the storage area where Running Wolf was hidden, Mary knew she had to take desperate action. She suddenly sat up in bed and announced that she needed to use the privy behind the cabin. Samuel initially refused to let her leave, but when Mary insisted that it was a matter of feminine necessity that could not wait, he reluctantly agreed to escort her outside while Jake continued searching inside. This was exactly what Mary had hoped for. Once she and Samuel were outside, she began walking very slowly toward the small outhouse, taking as much time as possible and asking Samuel to help support her weak legs. She was buying precious minutes for Running Wolf to escape through the back window of the cabin. But Jake Crawford was not as patient as his father. Left alone inside the cabin, he decided to conduct a more thorough search of the storage area that had been bothering him all day. He began pulling down the hanging blankets and moving aside the stored supplies, determined to uncover whatever secrets the space might contain. Running Wolf heard Jake approaching and knew that his hiding place was about to be discovered. He had remained motionless for hours, but now he prepared to defend himself and the woman who had risked her own safety to protect him. His hand closed around the handle of his knife as the blankets were pulled away, and Jake's startled face appeared in the opening. For a split second, both men stared at each other in shocked surprise. Then Jake opened his mouth to shout a warning to his father, and Running Wolf had no choice but to act. He lunged forward and clamped his hand over Jake's mouth, wrestling the younger man to the ground before he could raise an alarm. Jake was strong and desperate, but Running Wolf had been trained as a warrior since childhood. He managed to subdue the struggling settler without seriously injuring him, then used strips of cloth to bind and gag him securely. Jake's eyes burned with hatred and rage, but he was helpless to call for help or escape. Outside, Mary heard the brief sounds of struggle and knew that her plan had only partially succeeded. She needed to keep Samuel distracted for as long as possible, to give Running Wolf time to get away safely. She began complaining of severe pain and weakness, forcing Samuel to help her sit down and rest before continuing to the outhouse. Running Wolf quickly gathered his few belongings and prepared to leave through the back window. But as he looked down at the bound and gagged Jake Crawford, he realized that the man would be able to identify him and lead a hunting party directly to his village. The smart thing would be to kill this enemy quietly and disappear into the forest, ensuring that no one could ever track him down. But as Running Wolf raised his knife, he thought again of his grandmother's teachings about the sacred nature of all life. This young man had meant to do him harm, but he was not actually evil, just ignorant and afraid. Killing him would make Running Wolf no better than the worst of the white settlers who murdered native people without provocation. Instead, Running Wolf made a different choice. He leaned close to Jake's ear and spoke in broken English, warning him that if he ever harmed Mary or her children, or if he told anyone about what had really happened in this cabin, Running Wolf would return and finish what they had started. Then he slipped silently out the back window and vanished into the thick forest that surrounded the cabin. When Samuel and Mary finally returned from their slow journey to the privy, they found Jake struggling furiously against his bonds. Samuel cut his son free and listened in amazement as Jake gasped out the story of his encounter with the Indian warrior, who had been hiding in their very midst. Mary played her part perfectly, acting shocked and terrified to learn that a savage had been so close to her and her babies. She thanked God that Jake had discovered the intruder before he could harm her family, and she begged the Crawford men to stay and protect her until her husband returned. But Samuel was no fool, and he was beginning to suspect that there was much more to this story than anyone was telling him. The Indian could have easily killed Jake, but instead had simply tied him up and escaped. This suggested either unusual mercy or some kind of prior relationship with the people in this cabin. As he studied Mary's carefully neutral expression, Samuel began to wonder exactly what role she had played in the morning's events. 3 days later, James Thompson finally returned from his trading expedition to find his cabin filled with neighbors and his wife recovering from an ordeal he could barely comprehend. Mrs. Henderson had arrived the day before and had taken charge of caring for Mary and the newborn twins, while Samuel Crawford and his sons maintained their protective watch over the isolated homestead. James listened in stunned silence as the various witnesses told conflicting versions of what had happened during his absence. Samuel insisted that hostile Indians had been operating in the area and had somehow assisted Mary during her labor, possibly as part of some larger plot against the white settlements. Mrs. Henderson argued that Mary had simply been blessed by divine intervention and had managed to deliver the babies through her own strength and determination. Mary herself said very little, claiming that she remembered only fragments of that terrible night due to her weakness and blood loss. She confirmed that someone had helped her, but insisted that she had been too delirious to know whether it was an angel sent by God or a flesh-and-blood human being. Her vague responses only fueled more speculation and debate among her listeners. James was overwhelmed with guilt for having left his pregnant wife alone during such a dangerous time. He had assumed that he would return well before the babies were due, but the difficult winter weather and problems with his trading business had delayed him far longer than expected. The knowledge that Mary and his sons had nearly died while he was away would haunt him for the rest of his life. Samuel Crawford organized a search party to look for signs of the Indian warrior who had escaped from the cabin, but the winter storms had covered any tracks with fresh snow. Jake continued to insist that the savage had threatened him, but his father was becoming increasingly skeptical of his son's version of events. The fact that Jake had been left alive and unharmed suggested that something unusual had occurred during that encounter. Meanwhile, Running Wolf had made his way safely back to his village, where he told no one about his strange adventure in the white settler's cabin. He knew that his people would not understand his decision to help their enemies, and he feared that knowledge of his actions might endanger other members of his tribe if the whites decided to seek revenge. But the experience had changed Running Wolf in ways that he was only beginning to understand. For the first time in his life, he had seen past the hatred and fear that divided his people from the white invaders and had recognized the common humanity that connected all living beings. The memory of those tiny babies sleeping peacefully in his arms, and of their mother's grateful eyes, would stay with him forever. As winter slowly gave way to spring, the story of Mary Thompson's miraculous survival became a legend throughout the territory. Some settlers claimed it proved that God was watching over the righteous pioneers who were bringing civilization to the wilderness. Others whispered that it showed the Indian tribes were not as uniformly hostile as everyone believed, and that peaceful coexistence might be possible if both sides could overcome their prejudices. Mary never spoke publicly about what had really happened that night, but she made subtle changes in her behavior that those who knew her well began to notice. She stopped participating in conversations that demonized all native people as bloodthirsty savages, and she always had food and water available for any travelers who might need shelter, regardless of their race or origin. Years later, when her twin sons were old enough to understand, Mary would tell them the true story of their birth and of the brave warrior who had risked everything to save their lives. She taught them that courage and compassion could be found in people of all colors and cultures, and that judging others by their appearance rather than their actions was one of the greatest sins a person could commit. Running Wolf continued to serve his people as a hunter and warrior, but he also became known for his wisdom and his efforts to prevent unnecessary conflicts with the white settlements. When young men from his tribe spoke of raiding isolated homesteads, he would counsel patience and restraint, arguing that not all whites were their enemies and that some might become allies if approached with respect rather than violence. The two people whose lives had intersected so dramatically on that stormy winter night never saw each other again, but the impact of their brief encounter rippled outward in ways that neither could have imagined. In a time and place where hatred often seemed stronger than love, they had proved that understanding and mercy were possible between even the most unlikely strangers. Their story became a quiet testament to the truth that in moments of great crisis, the best of human nature can emerge to overcome the worst of human prejudice. And somewhere in the vast Nebraska wilderness, two peoples who had been taught to see each other as enemies had discovered that the bonds of compassion could be stronger than the barriers of culture and race.